On the 30th of April 1945, Adolf Hitler ended his life in the Führerbunker bunker in Berlin. On May 8th, the Wehrmacht surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II in Europe. But what would have happened if the dictator had not committed suicide? The entire 20th century might have turned out very differently. In this video, we want to look at 3 different possible scenarios that could have changed everything. The video will be interesting and educational, so stay tuned here at Wisefool. Before we go into the different possible scenarios, we first want to briefly describe the initial situation in which Adolf Hitler and Germany found themselves. By the time of Hitler's suicide in April 1945, the German Reich was on its last legs. World War II, which had been declared by Hitler several years earlier, had left a trail of destruction across Europe and the world, with Berlin at the center of it. The city had become a besieged fortress. The Soviet Union's Red Army was advancing relentlessly from the east and had completely surrounded the city. The Western Allies, led by the United States and Great Britain, had already crossed the Rhine and were pressing from the west into the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht's military resistance was crumbling on all fronts. Adolf Hitler, the once all-powerful dictator, sat in the Führerbunker bunker deep beneath the Reich Chancellery. The vision that had guided him for so long had collapsed. The once magnificent streets and buildings of Berlin had been reduced to ruins, with bombing and machine gun fire continuing day and night in the city. Hitler, who had not appeared in public since January 1945, spent his last days in a state of increasing paranoia and despair. Reports of treason and mutiny among his officers kept coming to him, and his crazy orders that his army should counterattack were being pushed into the void. On the 22nd of April, Hitler finally realized that the war was lost. In a hectic meeting with his generals, he declared that he would stay in Berlin and fight to the end. But he was also determined not to fall alive into enemy hands. The thought of being captured by the Soviets and possibly paraded as a war criminal was unbearable to him. Hitler declared on the 22nd of April that the war was lost and that everyone could leave him to go to safety because he would remain till the end in Berlin. In the last days before his death, Hitler dictated his will. He also married his longtime companion Eva Braun in the bunker. While the fighting raged outside, Hitler and Braun prepared for their joint suicide. On April 30th, shortly after 3 p.m., Hitler retired to his private office in the bunker. A shot was fired, and when the door was opened, the bodies of the dictator and his wife were found. Hitler had killed himself with a pistol, while Eva Braun had taken a cyanide capsule. But what if Adolf Hitler had not committed suicide, but had decided to continue the struggle? If Hitler had let the fighting continue, the situation for the German Reich would have become even more desperate. The military situation was already disastrous. The Allies had almost surrounded Berlin, and the Western Front was overrun by American and British troops. German resources, both human and material, had been exhausted, and supply routes had been largely cut off. Under these circumstances, further resistance would only delay the inevitable. The surrender of the German Wehrmacht on the 8th of May 1945 would hardly have been significantly delayed. The Red Army would have reached the Teltow Canal on the 6th day, and between the Soviet tanks and the center of Berlin, there would have been only a 36-meter wide waterway. The desperate battle would have resulted in even more civilian casualties and even greater destruction of German infrastructure. Cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, already badly damaged, would probably have been completely destroyed. If Hitler had continued the battle, the suffering of the German population would have been greatly prolonged. Millions of civilians, already suffering from bombing, starvation, and the constant danger of battle, would have been exposed to these horrors without any protection. The humanitarian disaster would become even more unbearable than it already was. Another dark chapter might have been the fate of German prisoners of war and the civilian population in the areas conquered by the Allies. Violent conflict and oppression, especially by Soviet troops, would likely have been even more intense and brutal. The victorious troops' desire for revenge, especially after the horrific revelations about the concentration camps, could have led to even more violent reprisals. If Hitler had allowed the fighting to continue, it would have resulted in further losses among the opponents. Greater resistance would likely have also affected plans for the post-war order, possibly leading to an even more severe division and punishment of Germany. All in all, Hitler's decision to continue fighting would only bring more destruction, pain, and death to Germany and the world at large. We now come to the second possible scenario of what would have happened if the dictator had fled abroad, as many other high-ranking National Socialists did after the war. As already mentioned, Berlin was surrounded by Allied troops in the last days of World War II. The possibility that Hitler could have escaped under these circumstances seems small, but not impossible. Some high-ranking National Socialists had already found ways to escape from captivity. Realistically speaking, Hitler could have tried to escape via secret air routes. However, there were only a few operational aircraft and airfields left that were not directly under Allied fire. An escape to South America would have been a plausible option, as many Nazi officials, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, found refuge in countries such as Argentina and Brazil. These countries often had opaque immigration rules and were characterized by political instability, which allowed fugitives to hide as long as they had enough resources and connections. Nazi criminals often fled with false documents through various countries, brazenly posing as poor war refugees. The idea that Hitler would remain unnoticed in exile is questionable. Because of his striking appearance and worldwide fame, it would have been a great challenge to hide him permanently. Despite the support of sympathizers, the risk of being discovered would remain high. The international pressure on the countries suspected of granting Hitler asylum would be enormous. The Allies, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, would make considerable efforts to capture the fugitive dictator. Another scenario would have been for him to flee to a neutral or non-cooperative region. Switzerland, Spain under Franco, or even remote areas of Asia could be considered possible havens. However, the practical challenges and political pressure would be enormous. Although Switzerland helped other Nazi criminals escape, there were several factors to consider. First, Hitler's physical and psychological condition had been severely affected towards the end of the war. It is doubtful that he could have endured the hardships of escape and a life in hiding. Secondly, his ideological obsession with ultimate victory and his unwillingness to give up was a major obstacle. For Hitler, the idea of surrendering to the enemy or escaping as a common criminal was incompatible with his self-image. If Hitler had continued to try to escape, the post-war world would have been faced with a new reality. The symbolic significance of his capture would be enormous. There would be the possibility of Hitler being held publicly accountable, which would be of great importance both for the historical account and for justice for the victims of National Socialism. All in all, the scenario that Hitler could have escaped and gone unnoticed remains a fascinating but unlikely possibility. His escape could have added a significant episode to post-war history, making Europe and the world face a different reality if he were to be tried. This brings us to the third scenario. What would have happened if Adolf Hitler had not committed suicide at the end of World War II, but declared an armistice or even surrendered? In that case, the Allies would face a complicated situation. The likelihood of them showing him mercy was minimal, as the main person responsible for the outbreak of war and the crimes of the Holocaust, Hitler was ultimately the symbol of absolute evil. The Allies would probably have directly punished the dictator if he had surrendered. The Allies had already decided during the war to bring the main war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trial of the main war criminals, which began on the 20th of November 1945 in Nuremberg, was supposed to hold the leading National Socialists accountable. In this first of the 13 famous Nuremberg trials, a total of 24 politicians, officials, and military officers were indicted. 2 were eventually sentenced to death and 7 to prison. Had he lived, Adolf Hitler would have been the main defendant in this trial. Under international law, there were clear provisions for dealing with war criminals. Crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity were the main charges. Hitler would have faced all these charges. It is more than likely that he would have been sentenced to death, as would the other main defendants mentioned, especially considering that he was in command of everything at all times, and therefore responsible for more atrocities than all the other defendants combined. But Hitler's surrender would not only lead to a trial against him, but would have far-reaching consequences for Germany and the world. The symbolic effect of the dictator's surrender could make the German people realize more quickly that the war was finally lost. As crazy as it was, Hitler's surrender could have meant a different course for post-war Germany. Allied occupation would continue to be inevitable, but the way in which the National Socialist legacy would be dealt with might have changed. The myth of the Führer's refuge and dramatic end would have been replaced by the image of a jailed and condemned dictator. The denazification and restoration of Germany would have taken place under different auspices. At the international level, Hitler's surrender would have affected the post-war order and the processes of establishing the United Nations. The Nuremberg trials would have taken on even greater significance because the main perpetrator of the Nazi regime would have been held to account. Moreover, there are speculative considerations about how a surrender would have changed the political landscape. The tension between the Allies, particularly between the Western powers and the Soviet Union, might have manifested itself earlier, as the question of how to deal with Hitler would have created new points of conflict. In sum, Hitler's surrender represents a scenario that would have both immediate and long-term consequences for Germany and the world. Now that we have dealt in detail with the question of what 3 scenarios could have happened if Adolf Hitler had not committed suicide, we would like to close with a very unrealistic but interesting scenario. What would have happened if Germany had continued and won the war? As has already been mentioned, defeat was inevitable given the situation at the time, and could at most have been delayed a little longer if Hitler had not committed suicide. But how could Germany and the world be today if Germany had won? A German victory in World War II would first mean that the National Socialists had achieved their military and political goals. Europe would have been reorganized according to the ideas of Adolf Hitler and his followers. The German Reich would have dominated large parts of the continent, from France to Poland and deep into the Soviet Union. National Socialist ideology would have prevailed everywhere, with a rigid racist hierarchy and brutal mechanisms of oppression. For Germany itself, such a victory would have meant an initial phase of triumph and expansion. Economically, the empire would have been strengthened by the exploitation of the occupied territories and their resources. The idea of a millennial empire would have been exploited for propaganda purposes in order to familiarize the population with the new facts. But this apparent prosperity would come at a price. The National Socialist regime would further strengthen its repression and control in order to suppress any resistance in its infancy. Europe would have entered a dark age of tyranny. The cultural and intellectual diversity of the continent would have been massively curtailed. The policy of extermination pursued by the National Socialists would have continued, and the large-scale ethnic cleansing of entire regions would have become a cruel reality. Jewry in Europe would have been almost completely wiped out, and other minorities would have suffered a similar fate. Political and military alliances around the world would have changed drastically. Britain, possibly weakened and isolated, would have had to either submit to a peace treaty or continue a desperate resistance. The United States would have found itself in a new geopolitical reality in which it would have had to confront a powerful and expansionist Germany. After a possible defeat, the Soviet Union would either have been completely crushed or turned into a satellite state under German control. Globally, the post-war order as we know it would never have emerged. There would have been no United Nations, which aims to ensure world peace and promote cooperation between nations. International politics would have been dominated by power blocks, with the German Reich playing a central, aggressive role. Colonial empires, especially European ones, could have lasted longer if they had been supported by the powers of the New Europe. Technological progress accelerated after the war by international cooperation would have taken a different direction. Scientists and engineers in the service of the Reich would have been able to keep their discoveries and inventions under strict military control, which would have prevented the dissemination and application of new technologies. The world would certainly be a different place today. The basic values of human rights and democracy, which are today considered universal, would be under constant threat. The world would be living under the shadow of a totalitarian superpower. A German victory would create a dystopian reality that would threaten human freedom and dignity to an unimaginable degree. Fortunately, none of this ever materialized. In retrospect, May 8, 1945 was not a day of defeat for Germany, as many Germans continued to see it for a long time, but in fact, a day of liberation. On the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the unconditional surrender of the Wehrmacht, the then federal president, Richard von Weizsäcker, thus uttered important words that are still as relevant and timely today. Hitler always worked to foment prejudice, hostility, and hatred. The plea to young people is, do not allow yourselves to be driven to hostility and hatred against other people, against Russians or Americans, against Jews or Turks, against alternatives or conservatives, against blacks or whites. Learn to live with each other, not against each other. With these words, we will close today's video. Like it if you found it interesting and subscribe to our channel. Bye and see you next time, here at Wise Fool.